On the morning of February 23, 1987, at approximately 9:47 a.m., a 28-year-old woman named Sarah Kendrick sat in the sterile examination room of Georgetown University Hospital's obstetrics department, 7 months pregnant, staring at an ultrasound image that her doctor had suddenly stopped explaining. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who had been providing cheerful commentary about the baby's position and development just moments before, had gone completely silent, her expression shifting from professional warmth to something Sarah would later describe as controlled alarm. The routine appointment, scheduled to check the baby's growth and confirm the due date, had taken a turn that Sarah couldn't quite understand, but instinctively knew was wrong. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known as she sat there with the cold gel drying on her swollen abdomen, was that the ultrasound technician had already placed a call to a number that didn't connect to hospital administration or another department within Georgetown's medical system. The call had gone directly to a secure line at the Central Intelligence Agency's Counterintelligence Division, where 3 analysts had been waiting for exactly this moment for the past 6 months. Because Sarah Kendrick's pregnancy, her beautiful, much-wanted pregnancy after 3 years of trying to conceive, was not entirely what it appeared to be. And the baby she was carrying, the child she had already named and dreamed about and prepared a nursery for in her townhouse in Alexandria, was at the center of an intelligence operation so unusual, so unprecedented in the history of Cold War espionage, that fewer than 20 people in the entire United States government knew it existed. The story of how an expectant mother became an unwitting participant in a Soviet intelligence operation that would later be classified under the codename Operation Cradle begins not in a hospital examination room, but 16 months earlier, in the carefully orchestrated circumstances that brought Sarah Kendrick and a man she knew as David Marlowe together at a medical research conference in Boston. Sarah Kendrick was 31 years old in the autumn of 1985, and if anyone had asked her to describe her life at that moment, she would have said it was exactly what she had worked for, but somehow less than what she had imagined. She held a doctorate in molecular biology from Johns Hopkins, had published 14 peer-reviewed papers on genetic markers in infectious disease, and maintained a Q-level security clearance that granted her access to classified biomedical research programs at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Her work focused on the intersection of virology and human immune response, research that had direct applications for both public health initiatives and, though this was discussed less openly, biological defense strategies that fell under the purview of agencies whose names rarely appeared in her official paperwork. Her personal life, by contrast, was sparse to the point of absence. She lived alone in a modest apartment in Arlington, spent most weekday evenings reviewing datasets under fluorescent laboratory lights, and had not been in a meaningful relationship since graduate school. What Sarah wanted, though she rarely articulated it even to herself, was a child. This desire had been growing steadily over the past 2 years, manifesting as a quiet, persistent awareness that her carefully constructed professional life was missing something fundamental. At 31, she understood intellectually that she had time, but emotionally, she felt the weight of years passing, of opportunities narrowing. The International Conference on Emerging Infectious Diseases took place in Boston during the first week of November 1985, hosted at a hotel near the waterfront, where the late autumn wind came off the harbor with enough force to make attendees hurry between sessions. Sarah had presented a paper on viral mutation patterns on the second day, and during the reception that followed, a man she had never met approached her with a glass of wine and a question about her presentation that demonstrated he had been paying very close attention. His name was David Marlowe, according to the conference badge clipped to his jacket, and he was, he explained, a medical technology consultant working with several biotech firms on diagnostic equipment development. He was 42 years old with dark hair, just beginning to show gray at the temples, dressed well, but not expensively, and possessed the rare quality of seeming genuinely interested in what other people had to say. Their conversation that evening lasted nearly an hour, and Sarah found herself enjoying the exchange in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. What Sarah didn't know was that this conversation had been planned with meticulous attention to detail. The man she was talking to was not David Marlowe, though he had been using that identity for 3 years. His actual name was Dmitry Volkov. He was a captain in the KGB's Directorate S, and he had been assigned to what Soviet intelligence called biological influence operations, a program so classified that fewer than 30 people in Moscow were aware of its existence. Volkov had been preparing for this moment for 18 months. He had studied Sarah Kendrick's published research, her professional trajectory, her security clearance level, and most importantly, her psychological profile, assembled by KGB analysts using intercepted communications and observations from conferences she had attended in Europe. The profile indicated that she was isolated, professionally accomplished, but personally unfulfilled. And most significantly, that she wanted children with an intensity that was beginning to affect her decision-making. She was, in the assessment of the analysts who reviewed her case, an ideal target for a long-term operation that required genuine emotional engagement rather than simple blackmail or coercion. The romance that developed over the following months was engineered with precision that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so fundamentally predatory. Marlowe lived in Philadelphia, far enough from Washington to explain why they couldn't see each other constantly, but close enough to make regular visits plausible. He traveled frequently for his consulting work, which provided cover for the periods when he needed to meet with his handlers. He called Sarah every few days, always at times that fit naturally into her schedule, never pushing too hard, but maintaining enough contact to build intimacy. Their second date was dinner in Philadelphia, where he demonstrated knowledge of her favorite cuisine without her having mentioned it, a detail he had learned from surveillance but presented as fortunate coincidence. By the spring of 1986, they were discussing marriage. Marlowe had proposed during a walk along the C&O Canal in Georgetown, producing a ring that was tasteful and appropriate. Sarah said yes without hesitation, feeling a certainty that surprised her, a sense that despite the relatively short time they had known each other, this was right, that David understood her in ways that other men hadn't, and most importantly, that he wanted children as much as she did. They married in August 1986, a small ceremony attended by Sarah's parents, a few colleagues from NIH, and several of Marlowe's supposed business associates who were, in fact, KGB officers maintaining their own deep cover identities. The wedding photographs would later be analyzed by CIA investigators looking for any sign that Sarah had been aware of the deception, but they showed only a woman who appeared genuinely happy, standing beside a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes in a way that was only apparent in retrospect. What Sarah didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly have understood as she stood in her wedding dress making vows she believed were reciprocated, was that every moment of their relationship had been calculated. The Soviet Union had invested enormous resources in developing a new form of espionage, one that didn't rely on stolen documents or recruited traitors, but on something far more invasive. They had pioneered techniques for using pregnancy itself as an intelligence delivery system, a biological manipulation that would take years to manifest, but could theoretically create compromised individuals from birth. The science was experimental, developed in classified facilities where medical researchers worked alongside intelligence officers to explore possibilities that existed in the gray area between genetic research and weapons development. Dmitry Volkov's assignment was to provide access to Sarah's body, to create the circumstances under which Soviet scientists could implement procedures she would never consciously recognize. The pregnancy she desperately hoped for would come soon, facilitated by a husband who monitored her menstrual cycle with the attention of someone following operational timelines rather than natural intimacy. And when that pregnancy was confirmed, protocols would be activated that had been prepared months in advance. Arrangements involving doctors who were not entirely what they seemed, and medical procedures that would serve purposes Sarah couldn't imagine. What Sarah wanted more than anything was to start a family, to experience the fundamental human connection between mother and child. What Dmitry Volkov had been sent to provide was something else entirely, a biological compromise that would turn her pregnancy into an intelligence operation and her child into an experiment. The distance between those two realities, between love and manipulation, between desire and exploitation, was the space in which Cold War espionage had learned to operate most effectively. Not in embassy safe rooms or dead drops in parks, but in the most intimate spaces of human life, where trust was absolute and suspicion was impossible, until it was far too late. The confirmation came on a Tuesday morning in early July 1986, 8 weeks after Sarah and David had begun actively trying to conceive. She had taken the home pregnancy test in the bathroom of their Alexandria townhouse, and when the second line appeared on the indicator strip, she stood there for nearly a minute just staring at it, feeling a surge of emotion so intense it bordered on disorienting. She told David that evening over dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction, and saw what appeared to be genuine joy. Though if she had possessed the training to recognize micro-expressions the way intelligence officers were taught to do, she might have noticed the brief moment of calculation that preceded his smile. David Marlowe, whose actual name was Dmitry Volkov, had been waiting for this moment with a different kind of anticipation. The pregnancy was the essential precondition for everything that would follow, the biological foundation upon which an operation code-named Project Genesis would either succeed or fail. He had specific instructions for what needed to happen next, protocols developed by Soviet scientists working in a classified facility outside Moscow. 3 weeks after the pregnancy was confirmed, David suggested that Sarah consult with a fertility specialist he had heard about through his work in medical technology, a doctor named Marcus Webb, who operated a private practice in Bethesda specializing in high-risk pregnancies. The suggestion was framed as concern for Sarah's age and worry that her exposure to various pathogens through her work at NIH might have created complications. Sarah agreed without much resistance. Dr. Webb's credentials appeared impeccable, his office was convenient, and the initial consultation seemed thoroughly professional. What Sarah didn't know was that Dr. Marcus Webb was not entirely who he claimed to be. His medical degree was genuine, his training was real, but his loyalties were divided. Webb had been recruited by Soviet intelligence 15 years earlier while completing a fellowship in Moscow, a recruitment that combined financial incentives with carefully applied pressure related to gambling debts and career-threatening mistakes. He served primarily as a source of information about medical research programs in the Washington area, but in 1985, he had been activated for a more specific purpose. The procedure took place during Sarah's 12th week of pregnancy in October 1986, presented to her as a routine chorionic villus sampling to screen for genetic abnormalities. Dr. Webb explained that given her age and occupational exposure, it would be prudent to screen for potential chromosomal issues. What Sarah experienced was mild discomfort and anxiety about the results. What actually occurred during those minutes when the catheter was inserted involved not just tissue collection, but the implantation of something else, a microscopic device so small it would be invisible on standard ultrasound. Imaging, designed to embed itself in the placental tissue and remain there throughout the pregnancy. The technology was experimental, developed in Soviet biological research facilities that existed in a gray area between medical science and intelligence operations. The device was essentially a controlled release mechanism containing compounds that could theoretically cross the placental barrier and influence fetal neurological development in subtle but potentially significant ways. The science behind it was uncertain, but Soviet intelligence had committed significant resources to its development based on the premise that biological manipulation might succeed where traditional recruitment had become increasingly difficult. The idea was not to create immediate damage, but to establish vulnerabilities that could be exploited decades later. Biological markers that would make an individual susceptible to chemical triggers or psychological conditioning. 6,000 miles away, in a secure conference room at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, an analyst named Margaret Chen was beginning to notice a pattern that troubled her. Chen was 43 years old, a career intelligence officer who had spent 2 decades working on Soviet biological weapons programs, and she possessed the kind of methodical, patient, analytical mind that excelled at finding connections in disparate information. In August 1986, a Soviet scientist named Alexei Petrov had defected while attending a conference in Vienna, and during his debriefing sessions, he had mentioned a program called Project Genesis that involved using American pregnancies for intelligence purposes. Petrov's information was fragmentary. He couldn't provide specific details about methodology or targets, but what he could say was that it involved long-term biological manipulation coordinated by Directorate S. Chen, had created a database of female researchers and government employees in sensitive positions who had become pregnant in the past 18 months. When she began cross-referencing this with another list, tracking individuals whose backgrounds contained minor inconsistencies that might indicate false identities, a smaller subset began to emerge. 7 women, all working in positions involving access to classified biomedical research, all married or in relationships with men who had entered their lives within the past 3 years, all now pregnant. Sarah Kendrick's name appeared on both lists. Her security clearance made her exactly the kind of target that would interest Soviet intelligence, and her husband, David Marlowe, had a background that looked solid on surface examination, but contained tiny inconsistencies. A supposed employer had no record of him. A residential address corresponded to a building demolished before he claimed to have lived there. A reference from a former supervisor had no memory of him. Each inconsistency was small enough to be explained by clerical error, but together, they suggested something more deliberate. By November 1986, Sarah Kendrick was under surveillance. FBI counterintelligence teams, working with CIA analysts, documented her movements, photographed everyone she met with, recorded her prenatal appointments, and built a comprehensive picture of a woman whose life appeared entirely normal. Her husband's movements were more concerning. David Marlowe traveled frequently, but surveillance teams noticed his travel patterns didn't always align with the business meetings he claimed to attend. He made periodic trips to cities where no corresponding business activity could be confirmed, and on at least 3 occasions, he was observed making brief stops in locations that served as known dead drop sites. The surveillance teams watching Marlowe were themselves being watched. KGB counterintelligence officers, operating under deep cover in the Washington area, had been instructed to monitor for signs that Project Genesis had been compromised. By December 1986, both sides knew they were watching each other, but neither was prepared to make a move that would expose their full knowledge, creating a delicate equilibrium where information was gathered but action was deferred. Sarah herself remained unaware. Her pregnancy progressed normally according to Dr. Webb's assessments, though she occasionally felt a vague unease she couldn't quite explain, a sense that something about her prenatal care felt slightly off. The feeling would come during appointments when Webb would ask overly detailed questions about her work at NIH, or when certain routine tests were being repeated more frequently than standard protocols suggested. But she dismissed these concerns as pregnancy anxiety. What no one yet understood was that the full truth would emerge in a way none of them anticipated. The device embedded in Sarah's placenta was designed to remain undetectable, but Soviet scientists had not accounted for every variable, had not perfectly anticipated how American medical technology would evolve. In February 1987, Sarah would go to Georgetown University Hospital for a standard ultrasound, and everything would change. Until that moment, she carried within her body not just the child she desperately wanted, but also a secret that would force her to confront possibilities she had never imagined. The examination room at Georgetown University Hospital's obstetrics department was painted in soft blues and grays, colors chosen to be calming, though Sarah Kendrick barely noticed them as she lay on the padded table with her shirt pulled up and the waistband of her maternity pants folded down. It was February 23rd, 1987, a Monday morning that had begun with light snow falling on Washington. She was 7 months pregnant, 28 weeks exactly, and this appointment had been scheduled as a routine growth scan to verify the baby was developing appropriately. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the perinatologist who had been recommended by Dr. Webb for this particular scan, had greeted Sarah with professional warmth, explaining that Georgetown's ultrasound equipment was newer and more sophisticated than most private practices, capable of producing images with remarkable clarity. The gel spread across Sarah's stomach was warm, and Dr. Hoffman maintained pleasant conversation as she began moving the transducer, adjusting angles to capture the images she needed. For the first several minutes, everything proceeded exactly as Sarah had experienced in previous ultrasounds. Dr. Hoffman pointed out the baby's head, the curve of the spine, the chambers of the heart beating in their rapid fetal rhythm. The baby moved as they watched, a slow, rolling motion that Sarah could feel from inside as Dr. Hoffman captured it from outside. Then Dr. Hoffman went silent. The change was abrupt enough that Sarah noticed immediately, the way the doctor's commentary simply stopped mid-sentence as she focused on a particular area of the screen, adjusting the transducer's position with small, precise movements, her expression shifting from professional pleasantness to something Sarah couldn't quite identify, but that made her stomach tighten with sudden fear. The silence extended for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt much longer, as Dr. Hoffman zoomed in on something, adjusted the contrast, switched to a different imaging mode, and then returned to the original view. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, her voice coming out smaller than she had intended, and Dr. Hoffman looked up with an expression that was carefully controlled, the kind of professional neutrality that doctors learn to deploy when they need time to think. "I'm seeing something in the placental tissue that I want to examine more carefully," Dr. Hoffman said, her tone measured and deliberately calm. "It's probably nothing concerning, but I'd like to get a second opinion. Would you mind waiting here for just a few minutes?" Before Sarah could fully process what was happening, Dr. Hoffman had set down the transducer and left the room, pulling the door closed with a soft click. Sarah lay there with the gel drying on her stomach, feeling the baby move inside her, and tried to control the rising panic. Something was wrong. Dr. Hoffman's face had shown something that went beyond routine medical concern, something that looked almost like shock. What Dr. Patricia Hoffman had seen on the ultrasound screen was something that shouldn't have been possible. Embedded in the placental tissue, approximately 3 centimeters from where it interfaced with the uterine wall, was a foreign object. It appeared on the screen as a small, geometrically precise structure, too regular to be biological, too deliberately placed to be medical error. It was roughly cylindrical, no more than 2 millimeters in length, and it appeared to have some kind of internal structure, layers or compartments that suggested sophisticated engineering rather than natural formation. Dr. Hoffman had performed thousands of prenatal ultrasounds over her career and had never seen anything remotely like this. She had left the examination room and gone directly to a phone, but not to call another obstetrician. The number she dialed was one she had been given 3 months earlier by two men who had identified themselves as federal investigators and who had asked her to call immediately if she saw anything unusual during an ultrasound examination of a patient named Sarah Kendrick. They hadn't explained what they were looking for or why, and Dr. Hoffman hadn't asked for details she suspected she wouldn't be given. But she had agreed to make the call if circumstances warranted, and what she had just seen absolutely warranted it. Within 40 minutes, Georgetown University Hospital's obstetrics department had been quietly transformed into something resembling a secure government facility. 2 men and 1 woman, all carrying credentials that identified them as medical consultants from the Department of Defense, had arrived and been given access to the imaging equipment and to Sarah herself, who by that point was sitting up on the examination table demanding to know what was happening and receiving only carefully worded non-answers. The woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Ellen Vasquez and who spoke with authority, explained that they needed to perform additional scans using specialized equipment, that there were certain technical questions requiring clarification, and that for Sarah's safety, it would be best if she came with them to a different facility where more comprehensive testing could be conducted. Sarah refused. She demanded to speak with her husband, insisted on knowing exactly what was wrong, threatened to simply walk out if they didn't provide actual information. Dr. Vasquez listened with patient attention and then said something that cut through Sarah's rising hysteria. "Mrs. Kendrick, we have reason to believe that something was done to you without your knowledge or consent, something that may pose a risk to both you and your baby. We need your cooperation to understand exactly what that is and what we can do about it." The ride to the secure facility took place in silence. Sarah sat in the back seat of an unmarked government sedan, one hand pressed against her stomach where she could feel the baby moving, and tried to process what was happening. Something had been done to her without her knowledge or consent. The words kept repeating in her mind, and with them came a cascade of questions she couldn't answer and fears she couldn't name. The technical truth, which would be explained to her over the following hours in language that tried to balance medical accuracy with comprehensible explanation, was worse than anything she could have imagined. During the procedure Dr. Webb had performed in October, the chorionic villus sampling that was supposed to screen for genetic abnormalities, something else had been implanted. A microscopic device, sophisticated beyond anything in standard medical technology, designed to embed itself in the placental tissue where it would remain undetected by normal prenatal monitoring. The device was a controlled release mechanism containing compounds that were already crossing the placental barrier, reaching the developing fetus, influencing neurological development in ways that were subtle but potentially permanent. The purpose, as best as intelligence analysts could determine, was to create biological vulnerabilities that could be exploited later. The compounds being released wouldn't cause obvious damage, wouldn't result in birth defects or developmental delays that would be immediately apparent. Instead, they were designed to alter specific neurological pathways, to create receptors or sensitivities that didn't naturally occur, to establish markers that could be activated years or even decades later through external chemical triggers. A child born with these alterations would grow up seemingly normal, would be raised by loving parents who had no idea their son or daughter carried hidden compromises, and then at some point in the future, perhaps when that child had grown into an adult working in a sensitive government position, the vulnerabilities could be activated. It was espionage conceived not in terms of years, but of generations. a form of biological manipulation that turned pregnancy itself into a weapon. Sarah sat in a chair listening to people explain this with clinical precision and felt something fundamental break inside her understanding of the world. The baby moving inside her, the child she had wanted so desperately, had been compromised by people she didn't know for purposes she couldn't comprehend. And the man who had helped create this child, the husband she had trusted absolutely, had been part of it. That much was clear, even before anyone said it explicitly. Everything she thought she knew was wrong. Everything she thought she had was contaminated. And the distance between the pregnancy she had wanted and the reality of what was happening inside her body had become an unbridgeable gulf. The arrest of David Marlowe took place at 6:47 a.m. on February 24, 1987, less than 24 hours after Sarah's ultrasound appointment had revealed what was hidden inside her pregnancy. FBI agents had been watching the Alexandria townhouse throughout the night, waiting for confirmation that Sarah was secure and that the decision had been made to move against her husband immediately. The concern was that Marlowe, if he had any indication the implanted device had been discovered, would attempt to flee or make contact with his Soviet handlers. Marlowe answered the door, still dressed in the clothes he had worn the previous day, his face showing exhaustion that suggested he hadn't slept. He had been expecting this moment from the instant Sarah failed to return home from what was supposed to be a routine prenatal appointment. When the lead FBI agent identified himself and stated that David Marlowe was being placed under arrest on suspicion of espionage, Marlowe simply nodded, said, "I want to speak to an attorney," and allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. There was no pretense of confusion or outrage, just the quiet resignation of a professional intelligence officer whose operation had been compromised. The interrogation took place in a facility designed specifically for high-level counterintelligence debriefings, a building whose location was classified and whose interior was constructed to prevent any form of electronic surveillance. Marlowe sat in a room that was deliberately austere, containing only a metal table, 3 chairs, and uncomfortable lighting. He waited there for 6 hours before anyone came to speak with him, though anyone watching through the one-way glass would have noticed that Marlowe displayed remarkable composure. When the interrogation finally began, it was conducted by 2 CIA officers who introduced themselves only by first names that were certainly not real. They laid out what they knew with methodical precision: his true identity as Dmitry Volkov, his assignment to Directorate S, his training in biological influence operations, the construction of his David Marlowe legend, his recruitment of Sarah Kendrick, the arrangement with Dr. Marcus Webb, and the implantation of the device. They showed him photographs from surveillance, transcripts of conversations, documentation of his travel patterns. Then they explained what they wanted: technical specifications for the device, information about what compounds it was releasing, details about whether removal was possible, and the identities of everyone involved. Marlowe listened without interrupting, and when they finished, he said something that surprised them. "I'll tell you what you need to know about the medical aspects, not because I'm cooperating with your investigation, but because I don't believe the child should suffer for this. The operational details about networks and personnel, those I won't discuss." Over the following hours, through careful questioning and Marlowe's reluctant but increasingly detailed responses, the full scope of what the Soviets had termed Operation Cradle began to emerge. It was an experimental program developed by scientists in a classified facility outside Moscow who had pioneered techniques for long-term biological manipulation. The concept had originated from research into how certain chemical compounds could alter neurological development if introduced during critical phases of fetal growth, creating permanent changes in brain chemistry. The idea of using this research for intelligence purposes had come from Directorate S officers who recognized that traditional espionage methods were becoming increasingly difficult. But biological manipulation, if it could be implemented successfully, would create vulnerabilities that subjects themselves wouldn't even know existed. Children born with altered neurological pathways could be raised as completely loyal Americans, could pass every security screening, and then decades later could be activated through chemical triggers that would make them susceptible to suggestion or manipulation. The technology was experimental, Marlowe emphasized. The Soviet scientists weren't certain it would work. That's why Operation Cradle had been authorized with a small number of target pregnancies, essentially clinical trials conducted on unwitting American subjects. Sarah Kendrick was one of 3 women who had been successfully targeted, selected because her security clearance made her potentially valuable, but also because her psychological profile indicated she was vulnerable to romantic manipulation. The other 2 pregnancies were ongoing, he believed, though he didn't have operational details. The device itself was designed to be irreversible once implanted. The Soviets had engineered it to embed in placental tissue in a way that made removal extraordinarily difficult. Any attempt to extract it surgically would likely require terminating the pregnancy. And even then, there was no guarantee the compounds it had already released could be neutralized. The alterations to fetal neurological development were probably already permanent. While this interrogation proceeded, Sarah Kendrick sat in another room receiving a different kind of devastating information. CIA medical consultants explained what had been done to her body and what it meant for the child she was carrying. They showed her enhanced images of the device, explained its function, and presented her with the impossible choice. Continue the pregnancy, knowing her baby had been biologically compromised, or terminate and live with the knowledge that the child she had wanted desperately had been destroyed by Cold War espionage. The psychological devastation Sarah experienced would never be adequately captured in classified reports. She learned that her husband had never existed, that David Marlowe was Dmitry Volkov, a Soviet intelligence officer assigned to manipulate her. She learned that every moment of their relationship had been orchestrated by people who viewed her as an asset to be exploited. She learned that her pregnancy had been turned into a weapon, that the child moving inside her carried biological alterations designed by Soviet scientists who had never met her and never would. By the time she was finally allowed to leave the secure facility, escorted to her parents' home because she couldn't bear to return to the Alexandria townhouse, Sarah Kendrick had been transformed. The distance between who she had been 48 hours earlier and who she was now felt infinite. Everything had changed. And the baby inside her was both her child and a Soviet intelligence operation, a duality she would have to find some way to reconcile. The weeks following the discovery existed in a state of suspended reality for Sarah Kendrick. She stayed at her parents' home in Bethesda, a modest colonial-style house where her childhood bedroom had been converted into a guest room, but still contained traces of who she had been before everything that led to this moment. Her mother, Patricia, moved through the house with determined normalcy, cooking meals Sarah barely touched, while her father, Robert, a retired civil engineer who had spent his career building bridges and understanding structural integrity, found himself confronting a situation where nothing he knew could help his daughter. They had been brought into the situation under strict secrecy protocols, required to sign documents threatening federal prosecution if they disclosed anything, briefed by CIA officers who explained the situation with clinical precision that made Patricia cry, and Robert sit in stunned silence. The psychological burden of knowing what had been done to their daughter transformed them into participants in a Cold War operation they had never imagined could touch their suburban lives. Medical experts arrived at regular intervals, brought to the house rather than requiring Sarah to travel, and each consultation delivered the same fundamental conclusion. The device could not be removed without terminating the pregnancy. The Soviets had designed it to be irreversible once implanted, embedding it in placental tissue in a way that made surgical extraction extraordinarily risky. Any attempt to remove it would likely result in catastrophic bleeding or placental separation, either of which would kill the fetus and potentially endanger Sarah's life. The technology's long-term effects were completely unknown. The compounds it had been releasing for the past 4 months had already crossed the placental barrier and influenced fetal development in ways that might be permanent or might be negligible. Dr. Vasquez, who had become Sarah's primary point of contact, explained the uncertainty with a frankness that was almost cruel. "We don't know if these alterations will manifest as anything observable," she said during one conversation in the living room while Sarah's mother sat nearby, hands clasped tightly. The Soviet research suggests they were trying to create specific neurological vulnerabilities that could be triggered by external chemical compounds later in life. But whether they succeeded is impossible to determine without long-term study. Your child might be born completely normal and remain that way forever. Or there might be latent changes that could be activated under circumstances we don't yet understand. The national security implications were presented with equal directness. CIA officials, including a senior officer named Thomas Brennan, who flew in from Langley specifically for these discussions, explained that carrying the pregnancy to term meant raising a child whose biology had been altered by a foreign intelligence service. Even if the Soviets never attempted to activate whatever vulnerabilities they had tried to create, the child would represent an unknown variable in American security calculations. The government would need to maintain monitoring protocols throughout the child's life, periodic medical examinations, and psychological assessments that would mark this person as forever connected to an intelligence operation they had no part in choosing. "We're not here to tell you what to decide," Brennan said, though his presence made it clear what decision the CIA would prefer. "But you need to understand the full scope of what continuing this pregnancy means, not just for you and your child, but for the country's ability to protect itself against threats we're still trying to understand." Sarah's maternal instinct had become a labyrinth of contradictory impulses. She felt the baby move inside her every day, kicks and rolls that were becoming stronger as the pregnancy progressed. And those movements triggered love and protectiveness that had nothing to do with Soviet operations or biological manipulation. This was her child, created from her body, alive because of decisions she had made, even if those decisions had been based on lies. The bond between mother and fetus wasn't something that could be severed by knowledge of what had been done. But alongside that instinct was horror at what had been done to her body without her knowledge, violation that extended beyond anything she had conceptual framework to process. Her pregnancy had been turned into an experiment, her womb into a laboratory for Soviet scientists. Every moment of the past 4 months had been occurring while compounds from a foreign device were crossing into her baby's developing brain. The intimacy of pregnancy, which should have been the most protected space in human experience, had been penetrated by intelligence operations in ways that made her feel fundamentally unsafe in her own body. Her parents struggled with their own impossible position. Patricia, who had raised 3 children and who had always described motherhood as the most important thing she had ever done, found herself unable to offer clear guidance. In private conversations late at night, she would say, "How can we ask her to terminate a pregnancy she wanted so desperately?" And then, minutes later, "How can we ask her to raise a child that might be dangerous?" Robert found that none of his engineering principles of force and load and structural soundness applied to a situation where every option caused irreparable damage. Through retrospective interviews conducted years later, after some details of Operation Cradle had been declassified, a picture emerged of intense internal debates within the CIA about how to handle Sarah's decision. Some officials argued that the government had an obligation to pressure Sarah toward termination, that allowing a biologically compromised child to be born represented an unacceptable security risk. Others insisted that coercing a woman to terminate a wanted pregnancy would be a violation of principles the United States supposedly stood for, that becoming like the Soviets in order to fight them was a form of defeat that transcended intelligence operations. The debate was resolved by a decision that came from higher in the government than CIA leadership. Sarah Kendrick would be allowed complete autonomy in her decision. The government would provide her with all available information, would make clear the security implications and medical unknowns, but would not pressure her toward any particular choice. If she chose to terminate, facilities and support would be provided. If she chose to continue the pregnancy, protection and monitoring would be established. The decision was hers alone. Sarah made her choice in early March, sitting in her childhood bedroom with her mother beside her and her father standing in the doorway. She would continue the pregnancy. She would carry this child to term, would bring into the world a life that had been compromised before it began, would accept whatever unknowns and monitoring and questions that decision entailed. When asked later why she had chosen this path, she would say simply, "Because it was my baby, and I couldn't choose anything else." The remaining weeks of Sarah's pregnancy unfolded under conditions that resembled both intensive medical care and protective custody. She was moved to a secure government facility in Virginia, a compound that appeared from the outside to be an ordinary medical complex, but that contained capabilities far beyond standard obstetric care. Her room was comfortable, designed to feel more like a hotel than a hospital, but the presence of security personnel made clear this was something else entirely. Her parents came 3 times a week, and those visits were marked by desperate attempts at normalcy. Conversations about baby names that everyone knew were absurd given the circumstances, but that provided some psychological refuge. Sarah had decided to name the baby Emma if it was a girl, a name she had loved since childhood, and that now carried additional weight as an assertion that this child would be hers, would have an identity separate from the operation that had compromised her biology. The birth took place on April 14th, 1987, 2 weeks before Sarah's due date, induced because medical consultants determined that limiting the device's continued exposure to the fetus was worth the minor risks associated with early delivery. Emma Kendrick was born at 2:47 p.m., weighing 6 pounds and 3 ounces, with dark hair and her mother's eyes, and a cry that was strong and healthy and completely normal. Sarah held her daughter for approximately 90 seconds before the baby was taken from her arms by doctors who explained gently but firmly that they needed to conduct immediate assessments. The immediate post-birth analysis revealed a baby who appeared completely normal by every measurable standard. Her reflexes were appropriate, her neurological responses typical for a newborn, her physical development unremarkable. Blood tests showed no unusual compounds or markers, though the medical team cautioned that this didn't necessarily mean the Soviet manipulation had been unsuccessful, only that its effects weren't immediately observable. The device itself, removed surgically from the placenta within an hour of birth, was sent for analysis to laboratories that existed in the deepest levels of government classification. The technical assessment revealed something both sophisticated and ultimately uncertain. The Soviets had created a controlled release mechanism that was remarkably advanced, capable of delivering specific compounds across the placental barrier in measured doses over extended periods. But whether this theoretical capability translated into actual, lasting changes in Emma's neurology was impossible to determine without longitudinal studies that would take decades to complete. The Soviets had created something that might have worked, but they hadn't tested it long enough to know. David Marlowe, whose real name was Dmitry Volkov, remained in federal custody through the summer of 1987. In March 1988, he was traded to Soviet handlers in an exchange that took place in Vienna, Austria. Two CIA officers, whose identities remained classified, were returned to American custody in exchange for Volkov's release. He disappeared into the Soviet intelligence apparatus and, after the USSR's collapse in 1991, simply vanished from Western awareness entirely. Sarah Kendrick left government research entirely, unable to return to work that required security clearances. She raised Emma as a single mother, moving to a small house in Maryland that the government helped her purchase as part of a compensation package. The CIA maintained periodic monitoring protocols, regular medical checkups for Emma that continued through childhood and adolescence, psychological assessments that were searching for signs of whatever vulnerabilities the Soviets had tried to create. Emma grew up knowing she was different in ways she couldn't fully articulate, aware that doctors paid more attention to her than seemed normal, conscious that her mother carried a sadness that was somehow connected to her existence. At 18, per an agreement established between Sarah and CIA oversight, Emma was told the full truth about her origins, about Operation Cradle and the device, and what had been done to her before she was born. Her reaction was a mixture of shock, anger, and a strange kind of relief that the vague sense of being different finally had an explanation. Emma, now in her 30s at the time retrospective interviews were conducted, lives what appears to be a completely normal life. She works in graphic design, has friends and relationships, and shows no signs of the neurological vulnerabilities the Soviets theoretically tried to create. Medical checkups continue, though less frequently, and she has been told that the CIA's interest in her case will likely extend throughout her life. Whether the Soviet experiment actually worked remains unknown, and Emma has said she prefers to live as if it didn't. The questions that couldn't be answered haunted everyone involved. Did the Soviets actually believe this technology would work, or was it experimental cruelty? How many other women were targeted? Dmitry Volkov had mentioned 2 other pregnancies, but whether those were carried to term, whether those children were born and are living unaware of their origins, remained matters of speculation. The full scope of the Soviet network was never completely mapped. The parallel to other Cold War espionage cases emerged not in location, but in revelation. The most invasive intelligence operation wasn't conducted in embassy safe houses, but in the most intimate human experience imaginable. Pregnancy, which should have been protected by every instinct and social structure, had been turned into a weapon. The Walmart arrest of a Soviet illegal had shocked people because it revealed that espionage happened in mundane locations, but Operation Cradle revealed something more disturbing: that espionage could happen inside a woman's body, that the distance between mother and child could be penetrated by foreign governments. Sarah Kendrick, interviewed decades later for a classified oral history project, spoke about the legacy with a combination of anger and exhausted acceptance. She had gained a daughter she loved absolutely, but she had lost the memory of joy that pregnancy should have contained. The months carrying Emma existed in her memory as surveillance footage, as clinical assessments, as the knowledge that her body had been invaded in ways she couldn't prevent. Emma existed, healthy and apparently unaffected, but the pregnancy that should have been beautiful was documented evidence in an intelligence operation. Sarah's pregnancy had lasted 36 weeks, 252 days that had been reduced in the historical record to a microscopic device and 1 ultrasound image, to classified reports that captured facts but not feeling. The distance between mother and child, which should have been the smallest distance in the world, had been compromised by forces that measured success in geopolitical advantage rather than individual suffering. That distance couldn't be fully crossed until after the device was removed, until after the war inside Sarah's body came to an end. And even then, something remained broken that would never entirely heal. The Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had collapsed, but Sarah Kendrick would carry the memory of violation until the day she died, would know that the most intimate experience of her life had been penetrated by strangers who viewed her pregnancy as an opportunity for experimentation. And that knowledge, unlike the device that had been removed and studied and eventually destroyed, would remain embedded in her forever, too deeply placed to ever be extracted.